Ma'am, you can't just walk in here like you own the place. Those would be the words, though. Naomi Hayes didn't know it yet as she stood in her kitchen that Tuesday morning, both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold while she was busy staring at nothing in particular through the window, watching the maple tree in her backyard drop its last October leaves one by one onto the wet grass below, as though the city itself were slowly undressing for winter, preparing for something new to take root. She was 44 years old, and she had been preparing for this day for longer than she could accurately measure, not in weeks or months of campaigning. Though there had been plenty of those, but in the accumulated weight of every morning, she had ever gotten up and chosen not to disappear. Every room she had ever walked into, where someone's eyes flickered with that particular shade of surprise she had learned to recognize before she could even name it, every time she had sat at a table where no one expected her to lead, and had led anyway quietly and without apology, until the people around her couldn't remember why they'd ever doubted her presence in the first place. On the kitchen chair nearest the door, her navy blue blazer lay pressed and waiting the kind of careful that takes 20 minutes and matters more than most people would understand. Beside it, a single sheet of paper, the final certification schedule printed that morning with the time circled in blue ink, 10 a.m. City Hall, Grand Ceremonial Hall. Confirmation of election results and swearing in of the mayor-elect. Mayor-elect Naomi Hayes. 44 years old. The first black woman ever elected to lead Halden City in its 112-year history. She reached out and touched the edge of the paper without picking it up, the same way she touched the small framed photograph on the countertop. Her mother, Iris Hayes, standing in front of this very house the day they moved in, squinting into the afternoon sun, with that expression she always wore when she was trying not to smile too widely because she thought it looked undignified, though nothing about Iris Hayes had ever been undignified. Iris had passed 3 years ago quietly and without complaint the way she had lived, and Naomi had since developed the habit of touching that photograph before every significant moment. Not because she was superstitious, but because it made the silence feel like conversation. From the hallway came the sound of small feet padding unevenly across the hardwood, and then Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, still half asleep, hair pressed flat on one side, wearing a dress with tiny yellow flowers that she had chosen herself the night before, with the absolute conviction of a person who knows exactly what the moment requires. Lily was 10 years old, Naomi's sister Pauline's youngest, and she was spending the week because her school had a staff development break, and Pauline was in Atlanta for work, and the original plan had been for Lily to spend the day with a neighbor. But Lily had stood in this exact kitchen 2 days ago and made the kind of argument that only a 10-year-old who has been raised by people who argue well can make, that she had never seen a real swearing-in ceremony before, that history was supposed to be witnessed, and that she had already picked her dress. Naomi had not been able to counter any of this. "Is it time?" Lily asked, climbing onto the stool at the counter and looking at the blazer on the chair, the way one looks at something that is about to become important. "Almost," Naomi said. "Eat something first." Lily took a banana from the bowl, studied it with the suspicious expression of someone who would have preferred pancakes, and began peeling it. After a moment she said, "Are you nervous?" Naomi considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm ready," she said. "Which is different." Lily thought about this, nodded slowly, and took a bite of her banana. Halden City sat in the middle of the state like a comma in a long sentence, the kind of place that newspapers described as mid-sized and historically significant, and facing the challenges of a changing demographic landscape, which was a careful way of saying that the city's institutions had been built by one group of people and were still being run mostly by the descendants of that group, even as the neighborhoods around City Hall had shifted and changed and filled with different voices, different languages, different faces that had been here long enough to be home, but not always long enough to be listened to. Gareth Whitlow had served on the city council as an alderman for 11 years, and in that time he had become, in the way that certain men become certain things, without anyone quite deciding it should happen, the unofficial custodian of the way Halden City had always been. He was 61, with platinum blonde hair that managed to look both carefully styled and aggressively natural, the kind of hair that suggested its owner had never had a bad morning in his life, and he wore his suits with the particular ease of a man who had never had to wonder if he was allowed to be in the room. He smiled often, and his smile was warm and broad and never quite reached the part of his face where genuine amusement lives. He had lost the mayoral election to Naomi Hayes by 4 percentage points, which was close enough that his supporters called it a statistical irregularity, and far enough that the certification board called it a decisive result. And in the weeks since the vote, he had been politely gracious in the way that people are gracious when they are still deciding what to do next. He had not attended any of Naomi's post-election events. He had not called to congratulate her. He had sent a brief written statement through his office that used the word transition 4 times and her name 0 times, which Naomi had read once set down on her desk and never mentioned again. The security detail at City Hall, the guards, the check-in staff, the building supervisors had been largely assembled and promoted during Whitlow's long tenure on the council. And while this was the kind of thing that happened everywhere and proved nothing by itself, it was also the kind of thing that Naomi had noted quietly and filed away because she had learned over a lifetime that the geography of who gets to decide who belongs somewhere is usually written in the smaller decisions, the hires and the habits, the unwritten rules that everyone knows and no one posts on the wall. The swearing-in ceremony was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the Grand Ceremonial Hall, the same room where every mayor of Halden City for the past century had taken the oath, and by 8:30 the hall was already being arranged by Derek Washington, Naomi's chief of staff, a sharp-minded 38-year-old who had worked on 3 mayoral campaigns and lost 2 of them before finding in Naomi a candidate who made him believe that the 3rd time was not about luck but about clarity of vision. Derek had sent Naomi a confirmation text at 7:15. Everything in place. Press access arranged. Judge Cawley confirmed. See you at 9:30. Naomi had replied. Coming by bus. See you inside. Derek had stared at that reply for 4 seconds before typing back. Of course you are. City Hall sat on the north end of Founders Square like an argument made in marble. 3 stories of pale stone-arched windows, a broad double staircase leading to iron and glass doors that had been polished to a shine that caught the morning sun and threw it back at anyone coming up the steps, so that the building always seemed to be looking at you before you looked at it. Naomi and Lily came across the square on foot, Lily's hand in Naomi's, the little girl with her notebook tucked under her free arm, a habit she had inherited from Naomi herself, who had always believed that the way to own a space was to be genuinely curious about it, to arrive ready to observe and record, to treat the world as something worth paying close attention to. It's like a castle, Lily said, tilting her head back to look at the building. Sort of, Naomi said. Except castles are for keeping people out. This is supposed to be for letting people in. Lily looked at her with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether an answer was complete or whether it needed a follow-up question. She decided for the moment that it was complete. 3 local press photographers were already stationed at the base of the steps, and one of them, Travis Bauer from the Halden City Courier, a 32-year-old with a press badge clipped to a lanyard and a camera slung over his shoulder, lifted his hand when he saw Naomi coming, the kind of casual acknowledgement that passes between people who have been in the same room enough times to know each other without being close. Naomi nodded back the way she always did, with press warm enough to be human and contained enough to be professional. Lily noticed the photographers and walked a little taller, then immediately seemed embarrassed by the fact that she'd walked taller, and then quietly straightened her dress instead, as though that had been the intention all along. Are those the people who'll take pictures of you today? She asked. Some of them. Will they take one of me too? Maybe, Naomi said. If you're standing next to me. I will be, Lily said with the complete certainty of a person for whom this was never in question. They reached the top of the steps, and Naomi pushed open the heavy glass door, holding it for Lily, and they stepped into the cool, high-ceilinged lobby of City Hall, and for one full breath, just one, everything felt exactly as it was supposed to feel, like the quiet wait of a moment before it becomes a memory. Then a hand came out in front of her. "Hold on a second, ma'am." Officer Brett Calloway had worked building security at City Hall for 9 years, and in 9 years he had developed the particular confidence of a person whose authority had never seriously been questioned. The kind of confidence that doesn't come from competence alone, but from the long habit of being taken at his word, of having his assessments accepted, of occupying a small domain so completely that the domain itself begins to feel like an extension of his own judgment. He was broad-shouldered and had close-cropped blonde hair the color of dry wheat, and his uniform was always correct, pressed, buttoned badge-centered. And he stood in the lobby of City Hall the way he always stood, slightly forward of the check-in desk, close enough to the entrance to be the first thing anyone saw when they came through the door, which was exactly where he liked to be. When Naomi Hayes walked through that door with a 10-year-old girl in a flowered dress, Calloway's hand went out before she had taken 3 steps. "Hold on a second, ma'am." Naomi stopped. The instinct to keep walking was there, it always was. But she had been managing that instinct for decades, choosing her battles with the precision of someone who knows that not every moment calls for a fight, that sometimes the most powerful thing is the pause, the steady look, the refusal to give anyone the emotional reaction they are anticipating. "Good morning," she said. "I'm going to need to see a visitor badge and an appointment confirmation before you come further." He said this pleasantly, the way a person says something they have said 1,000 times before, as though it required no thought. "I have an appointment," Naomi said. "I'm Naomi Hayes. I'm here for the swearing-in ceremony at 10 o'clock. Calloway looked at her. Then he looked at Lily. Then he looked back at Naomi with the expression of a man running a calculation he has already made up his mind about. "I'll need to verify that in the system," he said. "Of course." Naomi watched him move to the check-in desk where a woman named Donna sat behind a computer screen with the particular posture of someone who has decided very deliberately to be very busy. Donna had platinum blonde hair, pulled back in a style that managed to look both professional and somehow brittle, and she wore a soft pink blazer that didn't quite match the institutional beige of everything around her. She glanced at Naomi once quickly with the practiced blankness of someone who has learned to see without appearing to, and then returned her attention to the screen. Calloway leaned over the desk and said something in a low voice, and Donna typed something, and then Calloway straightened up and turned back to Naomi and said, "I'm not seeing a confirmed entry in our visitor log for your name." "It would be listed under the swearing-in ceremony for the mayor-elect," Naomi said. She kept her voice level and clear the way she had been keeping it her entire adult life, as though her own steadiness were a gift she was giving to the moment rather than something she was fighting to maintain. "You should see the entire event in the system. It's been scheduled for 6 weeks. Calloway tilted his head slightly the way a person does when they are performing skepticism rather than actually being skeptical. "We have a lot of events scheduled in this building, ma'am. I need a specific appointment confirmation or a visitor authorization code." Lily had not moved since they stopped. She was standing exactly where she'd been, slightly behind Naomi's left side, holding her notebook with both hands now instead of one, and she was watching Calloway with the wide, clear, unblinking attention of a child who has not yet learned that it is considered polite to pretend that what is happening is not happening. Naomi reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and produced her cell phone, pulling up the confirmation email from Derek Washington's office. The one with the event details, the time, the address. Her name and title printed clearly at the top in a font that was not ambiguous. And she held it toward Calloway the way she might hand someone a document, not thrusting it, not demanding, simply offering it as evidence the way a reasonable person offers evidence when asked for it. Calloway looked at the screen for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need to verify this independently. Our system has to match the entry." "Then check your system," Naomi said. Donna at the desk had still not looked up. Calloway pulled a radio from his belt and made a quiet call, and while he waited for a response, a second officer appeared from a side corridor. Officer Sandra Pike, who had light blonde hair pulled back in a low ponytail, with the neat, exact posture of someone who has been trained to project authority as the primary component of all communication. Pike came to stand beside Calloway in a way that was not accidental, the two of them forming a horizontal line between Naomi and the interior of the building, and though no one had made any overt physical movement, the geometry of the situation had shifted in a way that anyone watching could read. Naomi reached for her phone to call Derek. She dialed. The call went to voicemail. Derek was inside, arranging chairs, confirming with the press pool running the particular gentle chaos of a ceremony about to begin. She tried again. Voicemail again. Outside the glass doors, she could see that Travis Bauer had come up the steps and was standing near the entrance, and though he wasn't pointing his camera yet, his hand had moved to the strap in the way that photographers' hands move when something is unfolding that they are deciding whether to document. Ma'am Calloway said, and the way he said the word had changed slightly. It had acquired a quality of patience that was not really patience, the kind of tone that belongs to someone who is no longer trying to resolve a situation and has begun instead to manage one. We're going to need you to step to the side while we complete verification. This area needs to remain clear for authorized personnel. I am authorized personnel, Naomi said quietly and without heat. We'll confirm that shortly. I am the mayor-elect of this city, she said. My name is Naomi Hayes. My swearing-in ceremony begins in 45 minutes in the room directly behind you. Pike said nothing. Calloway said, We understand that's what you're telling us. From the desk, Donna had finally looked up. She was looking at Naomi now with an expression that was entirely unreadable, and then she looked back at her screen and something moved across her face that might have been discomfort, and might have been its opposite, and she said nothing at all. Lily had moved closer to Naomi's side, not pressing, not hiding, just present her small shoulder against Naomi's arm in the silent, instinctive way that children offer comfort when they sense that the adult they love is being required to absorb something heavy. Calloway asked Naomi to step to the side away from the main entrance corridor toward a stretch of wall near a water fountain where a single bench stood under a bulletin board papered with city notices, and because she had no legal grounds to refuse a direct request from building security, and because she understood that refusing would only be used against her in whatever account of this moment would later be constructed. Naomi walked to the bench and sat down, and Lily sat beside her without being asked. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside through the glass, the square was going about its morning pigeons on the fountain edge. A man in a delivery uniform crossing with a handcart. Two women in professional clothes talking as they came up the steps, and it all looked completely, perfectly ordinary from here. The way the world outside a window always looks ordinary, even when the room you're in is not. Lily looked at the officers who were now speaking quietly to each other near the check-in desk. She looked at Donna, who was staring at her monitor. She looked at the large seal of Halden City mounted on the wall above the interior doors. The oak tree, the river, the Latin motto that meant something about endurance. And she looked at it for a long time with the expression she wore when she was reading something that didn't quite make sense yet. Then she looked up at Naomi and said in the clear, uncomplicated voice of a child who has not yet learned to wrap her questions in protective softness, "Did you do something wrong?" The question landed in the space between them with the particular weight that only honest questions carry, and Naomi felt it land, felt it precisely before she turned to face her niece and said, "No, baby." "I didn't." "Then why can't we go in?" Because sometimes, Naomi said, carefully touching Lily's chin to keep the conversation close, and quiet people look at someone and see what they're expecting to see instead of what's actually there. And when that happens, the person being looked at has to be patient while the truth catches up. Lily considered this for 3 full seconds. "That doesn't seem fair," she said. "It isn't," Naomi agreed. Lily looked back at the officers, and the particular clarity in her gaze, that unfiltered, undiluted seeing of a 10-year-old who has not yet learned to look away from things, seemed to make Calloway, who had glanced over, look away first. What Naomi didn't know yet was that Travis Bauer had his camera up now. He had been watching through the glass door, and he had started recording the moment the two officers moved to block the entrance, and he had continued recording as Naomi and Lily walked to the bench, and he had captured the whole conversation from outside in silence, the way Lily had leaned against Naomi's arm, the way Naomi had touched the girl's chin, the two of them together in the corner of the lobby of City Hall, dressed for a ceremony they could not yet attend. And the footage was already remarkable before a Channel 7 news van turned into the square, following a tip from a stringer who had been monitoring police radio and civic event schedules and had put two things together that shouldn't have needed to be put together. Calloway's radio crackled again. He listened, then spoke into it, and whatever the response was, his posture shifted not much. Not dramatically, but enough that Pike noticed and leaned slightly toward him, and they exchanged a look that people exchange when a situation has reached a point that they hadn't planned for. Then Calloway walked back toward Naomi. "Ma'am," he said, "we're going to need you to come with us to the secondary verification office while this is resolved. Just a formality." Lily looked up at him. Her eyes were perfectly calm. "She didn't do anything wrong," she said. Calloway looked at the 10-year-old for a moment, then looked away. "I understand you believe that," he said, and the sentence was one of the most revealing things he had said all morning. Travis Bauer had covered Halden city politics for 7 years, and in 7 years he had learned the difference between a story and a moment. A story was something you could explain in a headline. A moment was something that had to be seen to be understood. And he was looking at a moment right now, pressing through the glass door into the lobby. Before Calloway could object his press badge forward, his camera still running. "Travis Bauer, Halden City Courier," he said steadily to the room. "I've been covering the mayor-elect's ceremony today. Can someone explain what's happening?" Calloway turned toward him with the automatic resistance of someone whose space has just been entered without invitation. "Sir, this is an internal matter. A woman who was just elected mayor is sitting on a bench in the lobby of her own city hall 45 minutes before her swearing in." Travis said, not loudly but clearly, with the specific composure of someone who has had this kind of conversation before and knows that volume is not the point. "If that's an internal matter, I think the public might want to know about it." From near the front doors, Frank Odom had come in. He was 68 years old, a former city legal counsel who had spent more time in this building than almost anyone alive, and he had been crossing the square on his way to a cafe when he'd recognized the woman on the bench in the lobby and stopped walking. He had 3 decades of institutional knowledge, and the slightly rumpled authority of someone who has been in every room that matters and has never needed to dress the part. He came to stand beside Travis and looked directly at Calloway. "I've known Naomi Hayes for 6 years," he said in the measured, unhurried voice of someone who doesn't need to raise it. "I've sat at committee meetings with her. I watched her announce her candidacy in this building. That is the mayor-elect of Halden City sitting on that bench, and I'd like someone to explain to me on what basis she's been asked to wait, rather than proceed to her ceremony." Calloway began to speak. Frank raised a hand, gently, not rudely, and said, "I'm not finished." Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Not a mob, not a protest, just the natural gathering of people who see something irregular and stop the way city dwellers pause at the edge of anything that has disrupted the ordinary rhythm of the square. Among them was a woman named Bernadette Lawson, who worked in the county recorder's office 2 blocks away and had been on her lunch break and had recognized Naomi Hayes from campaign signs immediately and without hesitation, the way you recognize someone you voted for. "That's the mayor," she said, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough that 3 people turned to look at her, and then turned to look at the lobby, and then at least 2 of them pulled out their phones. Travis had his camera rolling. 2 other people in the growing crowd outside were live streaming. The Channel 7 van, which had parked at the edge of the square, was already positioning a camera on a tripod aimed at the City Hall entrance. Inside, Naomi sat on the bench with Lily beside her, and she was watching all of this, the camera, the crowd, the people beyond the glass whose faces were turned toward her, with an expression that was perfectly still, not frozen, but composed the way a person is composed when they have made a decision about who they are going to be inside a difficult moment, and they are keeping that decision. Naomi called Josephine Wade. Alderman. Josephine Wade was Naomi's closest ally on the city council, a sharp, deliberate woman who had been the first to endorse Naomi's campaign, and who had a reputation for arriving at the right moment with the right information and using both without wasting either. She picked up on the first ring. Naomi said 4 sentences. She kept them short and factual. Wade said, "I'm coming right now," and ended the call. In the time between that call and Wade's appearance, the video of the lobby had begun to move through the world in the fast, uncontrolled way that videos move when they carry something unmistakable in them. And what was unmistakable in this video was not a dramatic confrontation. Not shouting, not chaos, but something quieter, and in its quietness, somehow worse. A woman in a pressed navy blazer sitting on a bench in a public building with a little girl beside her, completely calm, waiting for permission to enter a room she had already been elected to lead, while 2 officers stood nearby doing absolutely nothing to resolve the situation. The clip was 23 seconds. It had been viewed 40,000 times before Wade reached the lobby entrance. In the press section of the Grand Ceremonial Hall upstairs, Derek Washington was standing at the back of the room reviewing a seating chart when his phone began to ring not once but 3 times in rapid succession from 3 different numbers. And when he looked at the first alert, he felt the blood leave his face in a clean, cold rush. He said a word he would not repeat in polite company, put the seating chart down on the nearest chair, and walked very quickly toward the staircase. On the second floor, in a conference room with a window overlooking the square, Gareth Whitlow stood with his arms at his sides looking down. The square below was not yet crowded, but it was gathering the Channel 7 van, the cluster of people near the steps, the faint motion of phones raised. He watched this for approximately 4 minutes. He did not move to the door. He did not call downstairs. A young aide knocked and entered, said something. Whitlow acknowledged with a single nod, and then Whitlow turned from the window and walked toward the conference room's inner door and closed it behind him. Outside, a man named Paul, the father of an 8-year-old boy named Thomas, who was holding Paul's hand while they crossed the square, looked at the crowd near the steps and then at his son, and said, "Keep walking, buddy." Thomas looked at the lobby and asked, "Why is that lady sitting by herself in there?" Paul had no answer ready for that, and so he said nothing, and Thomas looked back once more before they continued across the square, and the question stayed in the air behind them. When you have spent your life learning to be still inside difficult moments, stillness begins to feel less like restraint and more like a language one that only certain people know how to speak, and only certain people know how to hear. And Naomi Hayes was speaking it now on that bench in the lobby of City Hall, her hands resting open on her knees, her back straight but not rigid, her face carrying an expression that did not perform suffering or dignity, but simply existed in both. The way a tree in wind does not perform its standing, but simply stands. Lily had leaned her head against Naomi's arm at some point in the past few minutes. Not dramatically, just the quiet lean of a child who is tired of something they cannot fix, and is choosing proximity as their form of protest. The notebook was in her lap, the half-finished drawing of City Hall, still open to the page she'd started in the square. She hadn't drawn anything new since they sat down. Travis was inside the lobby now, camera running, positioned near the wall where he could see both Naomi and the check-in desk without blocking the walkway. He wasn't asking questions yet. He understood that the scene was speaking for itself. Calloway had made 2 more radio calls and was now standing near the desk with Pike, both of them speaking in low voices, and whatever the radio had told them, it had not resolved the situation. It had, if anything, made their posture more careful, the way people become careful when they have begun to suspect that the ground is less solid than it was. Naomi, watching all of this from the bench without appearing to watch, it reached into her blazer pocket and drew out her phone again, this time not to make a call, but to read, because her phone was filling with messages now from Derek, from Josephine Wade, from 3 numbers she didn't immediately recognize, and from the campaign's communications director, whose message read simply, "It's everywhere. We're watching. How are you?" She started to type a reply and stopped. She looked at the screen, and then she looked at Lily, who had straightened up and was now watching the door with the focused attention she brought to things she was trying to understand. Lily said the Vietnamese word for aunt that she used with Naomi the way all the family used it. A small intimacy they had never translated out of, and she said it in a whisper, leaning toward Naomi's ear. "Are you scared?" Naomi turned and looked at her niece for a long moment, the way you look at someone when you are deciding to tell them something true rather than something comfortable. "Yes," she said. "A little." Lily absorbed this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said, "Me too, but you're still here." The front door opened. Josephine Wade walked in, and behind her, Derek Washington, still slightly out of breath from coming down the stairs, holding a folder of documents that he pressed into Wade's hands before she had even stopped moving, and Wade walked directly to Calloway and placed those documents on the check-in counter with a firmness that was not aggression, but was absolutely not the absence of aggression either. And she said something that made Calloway look at the papers, and then look at Naomi, and then look at the papers again. The documents that Josephine Wade placed on the counter were not complicated, which was the point. They were the kind of documents that, once you looked at them, made the conversation around them collapse entirely, because there was nothing left to debate. Official certification of election results. City of Halden bearing the seal of the State Board of Elections, dated 3 weeks prior. Letter of appointment authorization signed by the outgoing mayor and the city clerk. Official schedule of inauguration proceedings, naming the Grand Ceremonial Hall. City Hall, 10 a.m. And at the top of the first document, in the bold, unambiguous font of official state paperwork, Naomi Hayes, Mayor-elect, City of Halden. Calloway read. Pike read over his shoulder. Neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched past comfortable, past professional, past anything that could be recovered by pretending it had not happened. Donna at the desk was still. She had not touched her keyboard in 4 minutes. "These are the official certification documents from the State Board of Elections," Wade said in the measured, precise voice of someone who has been in courtrooms and council chambers long enough to know that the delivery of information is never just the delivery of information. It is always also a statement about power, and she was making the statement clearly. The mayor-elect's presence in this building today is not a visitor request. It is not subject to a check-in procedure. It is her legal and constitutional right as the duly elected leader of this city. Calloway set the documents down on the counter. He did not hand them back. He looked once more at Naomi across the lobby. Then he stepped to the side. Not dramatically, not with any words. He simply moved a lateral step, a small physical concession that was enormous in what it acknowledged, and the pathway between Naomi and the interior of City Hall was clear. No apology came, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what had just occurred beyond the movement itself, and Naomi had been expecting this, had known since she sat down on that bench that when this moment came it would come exactly like this, not with remorse, not with recognition, but with the flat mechanical efficiency of an institution absorbing the consequence of a mistake without admitting the mistake had been a choice. She had been expecting it. It still cost something. She stood up from the bench, smoothed the front of her blazer once, and turned to Lily, who was already on her feet with her notebook under her arm, and the look of someone who has been ready to leave since before they sat down. By the time Naomi was on her feet, the lobby had accumulated an audience it had not planned for Travis with his camera. Frank Odom still standing near the door. Two other members of the press who had come in behind Wade, and through the glass the Channel 7 operator with the camera on the tripod, who had been running for the past 12 minutes, and the small crowd of people in the square who had stopped moving and were watching the building the way people watch a window when they can tell something is happening inside, even if they can't see the details. Derek Washington was standing near the elevator, breathing normally again, watching Naomi with an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and was not entirely succeeding. She caught his eye as she crossed the lobby, and what passed between them in that look was not words. There were no words adequate to it anyway, but the shared recognition that something had just happened that both of them understood completely, and neither of them would ever entirely put down. Upstairs, word had already reached the ceremonial hall. Two of the council members who had been waiting inside had come to the second-floor corridor and were looking down at the lobby from the mezzanine rail, and one of them, Alderman Terrence Beale, who had been in city government for 20 years and had seen a great deal and been surprised by very little of it, stood with his hands on the railing and said nothing at all, just watched with the expression of a man cataloging something for a record he was keeping privately. Whitlow's conference room door remained closed. In the square, Bernadette Lawson was still there. She had been there the whole time, not moving her lunch break long, forgotten her hands in her coat pockets. And when she saw Naomi cross the lobby through the glass, she exhaled slowly and said again to no one in particular, but clearly, "There she is." The man beside her, a stranger she had never met, said, "About time." Naomi crossed the lobby at a pace that was not hurried and was not slow, and she crossed it with Lily's hand in hers, and she crossed it without looking at Calloway or Pike or Donna. Not because she was performing composure, but because she had already given those three people what the moment required: the stillness, the evidence, the patience, and she had nothing left to give them, and didn't intend to try. She reached the interior door, and Wade pushed it open from the other side, and Derek held it, and the way through was clear. She stopped. She turned. She looked at the lobby the way you look at something you want to remember accurately, not sentimentally, not with the softening that memory sometimes applies to difficult things, but precisely the way her mother had taught her to look at the world as something you are responsible for seeing clearly. Travis's camera was on her. The Channel 7 camera through the glass was on her. Probably 4 or 5 phones she couldn't identify. She was aware of all of this and made no adjustment for it. Then she looked at Lily. Lily was looking back at her with the focused, unsentimental gaze of a 10-year-old who has just spent 40 minutes watching something she will spend the rest of her life trying to understand, and her notebook was under her arm, and her dress with the yellow flowers was perfectly straight, and she was absolutely present. "Ready?" Naomi asked. "I've been ready," Lily said. "And if you had been watching from outside, and thousands of people were watching from outside by this point on their phones on the Channel 7 live stream in the square, what you would have seen was not a mayor walking into her city hall after a humiliation, though that is what it was. What you would have seen was a woman in a navy blazer and a little girl in a flowered dress walking through a door together hand in hand at exactly the pace they chose. This is when Naomi would want you to stop and ask yourself if no one had been recording today, if there had been no cameras, no Travis Bauer, no crowd. Would any of this have been different? Would anyone have stopped it? And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, that discomfort is the whole point. Stories like this happen every day in buildings exactly like this one, and the only difference is whether someone is watching. If this story is reaching you, if it is landing somewhere real, then please take a moment to share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel, because the stories we tell about justice matter, and this one is not finished yet. The Grand Ceremonial Hall on the first floor of City Hall had been used for 100 years of inaugurations, proclamations, and city council addresses, and it had been decorated that morning with the particular combination of gravity and celebration that significant public events require. White and gold arrangements on the flanking tables. The city seal hung in place on the back wall. 2 rows of chairs for invited guests already mostly filled the kind of soft institutional lighting that made everything look like it was already historical. When Naomi Hayes walked in, the room did not go silent dramatically. It was not a movie entrance with a swelling score. It simply settled the way a room settles when the person everyone has been waiting for has finally arrived, and everyone all at once adjusts to that fact. She walked down the center aisle with Wade on one side and Derek on the other, and Lily at her left, still holding her hand, and the guests, council members, city officials, a handful of community leaders. The press section along the right wall watched with expressions that ran the full range from relieved to stricken to carefully blank, depending on who they were and what they had known while she was standing in that lobby. Derek leaned toward Naomi and said in a voice only she could hear, "I am so sorry. I should have come out the moment I couldn't reach you." Naomi looked at him. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." He nodded, but he looked like a man who would be examining that moment for a long time. Lily, taking in the room with those wide recording eyes of hers, put her mouth near Naomi's ear and said, "This is the part they'll show in school, isn't it?" "The ceremony part? Probably," Naomi said. Good Lily said, "They should also show the other part." Naomi squeezed her hand. Gareth Whitlow entered the room from the side corridor that connected to the administrative wing, and he entered it exactly as he always entered every room, unhurried, composed, carrying the particular ease of a man who has always been able to walk into places without wondering whether he would be asked to leave. His suit was a deep blue, perfectly pressed, and his platinum blonde hair was in the same precise arrangement it had been in all morning, and his expression was the one he reserved for situations that required what he internally described as managed graciousness, which was his term for the performance of pleasantness in the face of outcomes he had not wanted. He moved toward Naomi with the air of a man arriving at a social event where someone he finds mildly inconvenient is receiving a promotion that he supposes intellectually was fairly earned. "Naomi," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I understand there was some confusion this morning with building security. I want you to know that I've already asked my team to look into how that kind of miscommunication happens, and I'll make sure." "Your team," Naomi said. Whitlow paused. "I'm sorry. You said your team." Naomi said with the same steady, unhurried clarity that had carried her through the lobby and through 11 months of campaigning and through 20 years of rooms where she was the only one who looked like her. "This building is no longer under your administration, Gareth. The security staff here will be under review by my office starting this afternoon. Not yours." Whitlow's hand was still extended. It hung there for approximately 2 seconds before he withdrew it slowly, as though he was deciding the withdrawal rather than it deciding itself. "Of course," he said. "I only meant I know what you meant," Naomi said. "Thank you for attending." She turned away. It was not a dramatic dismissal. She did not raise her voice, did not make a speech about what had happened in the lobby, did not invite the room to witness her righteousness. She simply turned and moved toward the front of the hall where Judge Cawley was waiting, and the conversation with Whitlow was over in the complete, definitive way that conversations are over when one person has removed the air from them. Lily, who had watched the entire exchange from Naomi's side, looked at Whitlow's retreating figure and then looked up at Naomi and said nothing, which in Lily's vocabulary was the most complete form of agreement. Whitlow found a seat at the far end of the guest row, and he sat in it with the posture of a man who has not yet decided what story he is going to tell about today, and when he looked at the stage where Naomi was now speaking quietly with Judge Cawley, his expression was not angry. It was something more difficult than anger. The expression of a person who has just understood concretely for the first time that something they believed was permanent has ended. Judge Ruth Cawley had been a municipal court judge for 23 years and had sworn in 3 mayors before this one, and she had been in this room when it was used for less pleasant purposes than inaugurations for emergency sessions during the city's budget crisis for public hearings about development decisions that had divided neighborhoods for the particular exhausted kind of official business that cities conduct at 2 in the morning when they have run out of easier options. And she had stood at this podium in all of those contexts and remained through all of them, a woman of compact, clear authority who understood that ceremony was not decoration, but meaning, and that meaning was what people needed when the procedural weight of an institution became almost too heavy to carry. She stood at the podium now with the city charter in both hands and looked out at the room with the expression she always wore before an oath, not solemn exactly, but present fully and deliberately present in the way that the moment required. Naomi stepped up to stand before her, and Lily stepped up beside her. No one had asked Lily to do this. There was no official role for a 10-year-old in a swearing-in ceremony. But Naomi had not let go of her hand, and Judge Cawley, looking at the 2 of them standing there, made no move to redirect anyone to a different position, because she understood with the long experience of a woman who has watched many rooms react to many moments that what was standing before her was already the image that this day would be remembered by. The room went quiet in that complete way, not the quiet of people waiting for something to begin, but the quiet of people who are already inside the thing that is happening and know it. Naomi put her left hand on the city charter. And in the small space just before she began to speak, she thought of her mother, Iris, who had cleaned these floors for 20 years, who had come through the service entrance on the side, because that was what the schedule required, who had never once complained about that, and had also never once suggested to Naomi that it was acceptable, who had looked at every room Naomi walked into and said, "You belong wherever you choose to stand." Not because the room would agree, but because the agreement was hers to give. "I, Naomi Hayes," she said, and her voice was clear and even and carried to the back of the hall without effort, "do solemnly swear to faithfully execute the office of Mayor of the City of Halden, and to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and serve the people of this city and the principles upon which it was built." Lily, standing beside her, had not been told what to do when the oath ended. She had not been coached or prepared or given a role. She was a 10-year-old girl who had spent her morning watching her aunt be told she didn't belong in the building she had just been elected to lead, and when the last word of the oath fell, Lily bent her knees slightly briefly like a curtsy, but not quite a small, private genuflection. To a moment she understood to be larger than she had words for. The room saw it. Several people, not all of them, had to look away for a moment. The Channel 7 reporter, a woman named Camille Reyes, had been in the press section during the ceremony and approached Naomi immediately after with the microphone extended and the careful, specific expression of a journalist who is trying to ask a question that is both important and not unkind. "Mayor Hayes," she said, and the title landed in the air of that hall like something that had been waiting a long time to fit where it was. "Can you tell us how you're feeling after what happened outside this morning?" Naomi looked at Camille. Then she looked down at Lily, who was still at her side. Notebook now open and a pen in her hand, apparently having decided that whatever came next was worth drawing. Then she looked back at the camera. "I want to answer your question," she said, "by telling you what I want my niece to remember about today." She paused, not for effect, but because she was choosing her words the way she always chose her words, carefully, with respect for what they could carry. "I want her to remember that this city elected someone to lead it, and that when she showed up to do that job, some people looked at her and saw something other than the mayor. And I want her to remember that the mayor showed up anyway. That she stood there. That she was patient and she was clear and she did not leave. And then she walked through the door. She let that sit for a moment. Because that's the thing about truth." She continued, her voice steady in a way that had nothing to do with performance. "It doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be present. And today, in this building, in this city, truth was present. And we went in. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, City Hall had become the kind of place that a building becomes when something has happened inside it that the building itself seems to be processing quieter. In some corridors, louder in others, full of the particular charged stillness of people who are trying to behave normally, while knowing that normal has been rearranged. The Channel 7 footage of the lobby had been broadcast on the noon news, and then again at one with a chyron that read, "Halden City Mayor detained at City Hall on Inauguration Day," which was not quite accurate but was close enough that the station's legal team did not flag it. And the social media video from Travis Bauer's account had by this point accumulated 320,000 views and was trending in the state under 2 separate hashtags, one of which was simply Naomi's name. Officer Brett Calloway was in the building supervisor's office at 1:15 p.m. The door was closed. The meeting had been called by the chief of building security, who had received 2 calls from the outgoing mayor's administrative office and one from the new mayor's chief of staff before lunch, and who had spent the morning watching the situation evolve through a combination of direct observation and increasingly alarming phone updates. Officer Sandra Pike had been called in separately also, with the door closed. Donna had not been called in. Donna had simply at some point during the lunch hour opened her desk drawer, taken out a small photograph and a hand lotion that had been sitting there for 3 years and placed them both in her handbag, with the careful, unhurried movements of someone who has decided something and is acting on it without drama. Frank Odom was sitting in the waiting area of the building supervisor's office when Naomi's chief of staff, Derek Washington, walked past. Frank stood and extended his hand. Derek took it. They exchanged the brief, complete look of 2 people who have been on the same side of something and know it. "She handled that better than any of us would have," Frank said. "She's been handling things like that her whole life," Derek said. "The difference is that today there were cameras." At 2:45 p.m., Gareth Whitlow stood before a cluster of microphones on the City Hall steps, the same steps where Naomi had stood that morning, which was a choice of location that no one on his team seemed to have considered until it was too late to change, and delivered a prepared statement about how deeply he valued the democratic process and how committed he was to a respectful transition of power. He called what had happened in the lobby that morning a regrettable procedural gap, and said he had already recommended a comprehensive review of the building's security check-in processes. A reporter from the State Tribune asked whether he had known about the situation while it was occurring. Whitlow said he had been in a meeting on the 2nd floor and had not been aware of what was happening at the entrance. Camille Reyes from Channel 7 stepped forward and said, "Mr. Whitlow, we have footage from the building's exterior security camera showing you at the 2nd floor window overlooking the main entrance at approximately 9:32 a.m. during the period when Mayor Hayes was being held in the lobby. Would you like to clarify your earlier statement?" The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long, but those 4 seconds were the kind that have edges. Whitlow said that he would not be making any further comments today, and that all questions about the security incident should be directed to the building administrator's office. He stepped away from the microphones without turning his back to them, the particular practiced retreat of a person who has learned that you must face the room even when you are leaving it, and walked back through the doors of City Hall with the expression of a man who has realized for the first time that he is not the protagonist of the story that today is telling. Bernadette Lawson was still in the square. She had gone back to her office after the ceremony and returned on her actual lunch break at noon, and she was sitting on the edge of the fountain eating a sandwich, watching the press conference wind down. When the reporter asked Whitlow the camera question and the 4-second silence happened, Bernadette took a bite of her sandwich and said to no one, "There it is." Naomi's kitchen that evening was the same kitchen it had always been. The same slightly uneven tile by the refrigerator, the same collection of mismatched mugs on the 2nd shelf. The maple tree outside the window, now completely bare in the late October dark, and she and Lily sat at the table eating pasta that Lily had helped make by adding approximately twice as much oregano as was necessary, which Naomi had decided was fine. Lily had her notebook open beside her plate. She had been drawing on and off since they got home. The lobby, the bench, the doors, the ceremony, pieces of the day assembled in her particular loose-lined style that was not quite realistic and was not trying to be. "Are they going to get in trouble?" Lily asked. "The security people and the lady at the desk. There'll be an investigation," Naomi said, "an independent one run by an office that doesn't report to the people involved. Yes, there will be consequences." Lily thought about this with the focused seriousness she brought to all consequential questions. "Good," she said, and it was not vindictive. It was the clear, unsentimental good of a person who believes that fair is a thing that should actually happen. She drew for another minute, and then she said, "D." "Hmm." "When we were sitting on the bench before the people came, I asked if you were scared, and you said yes." She looked up. "But you didn't look it." Naomi set her fork down. "That's because she said being scared and standing still are two different things. And being scared and keeping your face calm are two different things. And being scared and knowing what you have to do, those are two different things too." Lily considered this very carefully. "So you were doing all of them at once," she said. "Yes." Lily nodded. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something at the bottom of the drawing in the small, slightly too large letters of a 10-year-old who takes handwriting seriously, and turned the notebook so Naomi could read it. She was scared, and she stayed. Naomi looked at the words for a long time. "That's it," she said. "That's exactly it." Lily tore the page out of the notebook with great care and slid it across the table. "For your office," she said. Naomi took it and held it in both hands and said nothing because there was nothing to add. 6 weeks after Inauguration Day, an independent oversight review concluded that Officers Calloway and Pike had violated building access protocols by failing to verify the identity of a confirmed event attendee against the existing schedule, and that the delay constituted conduct unbecoming of public officials. Both were suspended pending further proceedings. Donna submitted her resignation before the review's findings were published. Gareth Whitlow announced through a brief written statement, no press conference, no microphones, that he would not seek re-election, citing a desire to pursue private endeavors which everyone understood to mean what it meant. The photograph that Travis Bauer had captured through the lobby glass, Naomi crouching to Lily's level on the bench. The two of them face to face in the corner of City Hall, with the seal of the city visible on the wall above them, was named Press Photograph of the Year by the State Journalists Association. It hung in Lily's bedroom with a caption she had written in marker on a piece of notebook paper taped beneath it. The day Dee didn't leave, the Halden City Council voted unanimously to rename the square in front of City Hall, not after Naomi, who asked them not to, but after Iris Hayes, who had cleaned those floors for 20 years and never once used the front entrance. One morning the following February, Mayor Naomi Hayes stepped off the number 12 bus at the edge of the square and walked alone across the cobblestones toward City Hall. Her breath visible in the cold air, her coat buttoned, no security detail. No press, no occasion, just a Tuesday, just work to be done. The guard at the front entrance, a young man who had started 3 weeks after the investigation concluded, looked up as she came through the door and said, "Good morning, Mayor Hayes." She said good morning back and kept walking, and she put her hand flat against the cold stone wall of the corridor for just a moment, not breaking stride, just touching it, the way you touch the shoulder of someone you trust. And then she was through the corridor and into the building. Her building. The city's building. The building that had tried to tell her she didn't belong and had been wrong, and she walked all the way to the end of the hall without looking back because she didn't need to, because she was already in.